Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Riley Lewis Show. I am your host, Riley Lewis. We have some interesting things to talk about, so let's just jump right into it. I want to say, by the way, I've been focusing much more of my time lately on my audio only podcast, which you can find on Anchor, Apple, Google, or Spotify. But now I'm going to put some time more into my YouTube channel because I really like YouTube. But that said, in the spirit of that, I'm going to go over some concepts that I have been covering in recent episodes on my audio only podcast. So if you've been listening to that, this may be repetitive for a little bit, but there will be new information, I promise, if you just hang in there until the end. So I'm going to basically just give a little background. I've been talking a lot about the difference between fragile states and weak states. And the reason I've been spending so much time talking about the differences between a fragile state and a weak state, especially through the lens of a peace builder and through a political lens, is because we have an election coming up. And I have a great fear that regardless of who gets elected, there's going to be some group of people, maybe a large group of people, who are unwilling to accept the results of the election. And if that is the case, then I'm not really sure if we'll have any 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 vestiges or institutions left that are still operational. The only thing I think that we still have at this point that all of our institutions are in trial right now. All of our institutions are being tried. They're all facing a trial of some sorts. And I think that elections are already a particularly vulnerable event, especially in a democracy, especially with our media culture and our 24-hour news cycle, and with the way that we treat each other, and especially with some of the political rhetoric that will amplify pre-existing tensions. So all of that said, I have a great fear that this election, regardless of who gets elected, will in some ways create more division between us, and what I'd like to see us do is start to get closer and to unity. So that's a topic I've been talking a lot about in my audio only podcast. And again, if you'd like to find that, you can find my audio only show, The Riley Lewis Show, on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Breaker. As well as, again, the Anchor.fm mobile app, or in the web browser on your computer or your phone, whatever. In any case, let's just get into today's episode. Enough of that stuff. So some of the things I've been talking about really are things like what is peace, what is conflict, what is violence, what is the relationship between peace and conflict and violence. And by the way, I made this analogy in a previous episode, again on one of my audio only episodes. I don't remember which one at this point, but you can go back and find it. And I made this analogy where basically we have a three-way intersection between politics, between rhetoric, and between conflict. And at the center of that, and really those are all different forms of conflict, basically. So at the center of this at the cross section of these three different levels of conflict is the election. Um, and again, elections are a particularly vulnerable point for a country because, well, especially if many people do not feel like the government currently represents them, and especially in a democracy, because that means our system revolves around representative government and elections. So elections are going to happen frequently, as they have been, obviously, and we have to be able to withstand the political tension that may be heightened by rhetoric and other things going on, and other events that accelerate some of those political tensions that already existed, without having the entire system collapse. And at this point, we have people who want to. I mean, look. There are some people who just want the system to collapse or want the country to collapse, and to those people, I'm sorry to hear that, but I think most of us want to make this thing work. And I think most of us want a peaceful, better world and want reform, not violent revolution. So I'm really interested in elections because, again, elections can be a very big point of conflict and can elevate tensions that already have existed. And so we have to be very careful to make sure that we are still able to peacefully pass power from president to president every 4 or 8 years. We still have to be able to do that transfer of power peacefully. To me, if November, regardless of who gets elected in November, if some people say, shoot, I didn't want this person in office, but they're still in, or I'm glad Joe Biden's in, however you feel, I just want people to be able to withstand that event without having a panic attack. I want us to be able to absorb that shock without completely collapsing. And so some of the things I've been talking about in my audio only podcast are some of these challenges that are really challenges for peace builders. So there are 5 key challenges for peace builders that I've mentioned that I want to talk about. Number 1 is inclusivity, which really relates so much to elections. How do you make it so that everybody feels represented and everybody feels included? And that is a very difficult thing to do, especially if inevitably people will have incompatible visions, incompatible ideas, and so it's very difficult to make sure that everybody, at least regardless of whether or not they are included, they must feel that they're included. We need to create that sense of inclusivity. Number 2, it's about a top-down and bottom-up approach at the same time. It's got to be grassroots and bureaucratic functionalism at the same time. We have to be able to have that reform within the government, and we also have to change. Number 3, from the center out and from outward in. So we need to be able to, again, change ourselves, introspectively, our intrapersonal conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, intergroup, and then international. And those are all, again, different levels of conflict that I've mentioned before in my audio only show. But moving on to number 4, political will. So American elections are categorized by some weird sense of great political apathy. For some reason, so many people move. It seems like more people who move here as immigrants are interested in voting than people who are born here as citizens already. I don't really understand why voting here is not cool or more, and I mean voting in local, county, statewide, and federal elections. I don't understand why it's not a bigger deal, but I would like to see much more turnout. You would think for a country like this one with so many things to talk about and so many opinions, you'd think that 100% of us are voting, but I mean it's usually less than half. I mean at best. So there has to be more of a political will to actually create some sort of change. And speaking of that, political will's really important because this is going to be a long-term engagement. This is not about short-term solutions or half measures. This is about long-term, meaningful solutions that will produce the sustainable, resilient society that we seek, that I would like to think about. Now, let's talk about some things that get in the way of that. There are a lot of misconceptions about conflict. I'm sure you have a lot of images that come to mind when you think about the word conflict. You may think of war, you may think of roommate conflict or conflict in classrooms or people yelling at each other on social media. You may think about other forms of disagreements or misunderstandings, maybe at holidays with family members about politics. That said, conflict is not inherently negative, at least not according to the United States Institute of Peace. In fact, the USIP would say that conflict is an inherent part of the human condition, and that conflict is neutral. And they say, quote, "It is how we approach conflict that determines whether it is positive or negative," which is a good thing. That means the power is with us. So we can even shape our conflicts as opportunities. So even the way we approach things and approach each other and think about it determines the actual constitution of the conflict, whether or not it will be positive or negative. Now, I mentioned levels of conflict, and I've been saying that word a lot, so I'm just going to go over those again really quickly. Number 1, intrapersonal conflict. I have tons of intrapersonal conflicts. I feel bad, I feel terrible anytime I use single-use plastic items. But some things only come in plastic, and I feel terrible about it. And there's so much plastic in the ocean, in our food, in our shampoo. I mean, it's all over the place. But, sometimes I have to use plastic, and I feel terrible about that, and I try to minimize it, when I can, and I use reusable straws and silverware, but sometimes I use plastic, and I feel bad about that. That is an intrapersonal conflict. Now there's also interpersonal conflict, conflict between two or more individuals. That means that maybe I have one goal and you have one goal, and those are different. Or maybe I have one goal and you have a goal, and our goals are actually counteractive to each other. Then there is, an even stronger conflict, or an even more urgent conflict. Then there's intergroup and international. Maybe international, two different countries. Intergroup, maybe two different communities in one state. So those are your levels of conflict. Let's talk about peace now, because I've been saying peace a lot also. Peace is not some place that we get to where the world is conflict free. Again, conflict is inherent in the human condition. We're not going to get to a world that's conflict free. I don't even know if we'd want a world that's conflict free. Conflict free means that there's only one aux cord in the car, and you and I want to play two different songs. That's a good thing that we have diversity in taste in music. So I don't even know that we'd want to live in a world that's conflict free. I'd like to live in a world that's free of violence, but I don't think that we'll ever live in a world that's free of conflict, so long as humans are in that world. So that said, let's figure out, what peace is then. Quoting the USIP, peace is an active process. It is not an end state. It is something that it is something we must work for and toward at all times. And that's right. It's an active thing. Peace is, like a job. It's something that you're actively doing, or a goal that you have. It's something that you're actively working on every single day with lots of different people, with all the resources you can find. It's not something that is just, an end state where you arrive there and then boom, peace, and that's it, the end of history. That's not how it goes. Peace is living with roommates and actively sorting through conflicts you have, because one day you ate his food, the next day he ate your food, and nobody's doing dishes, and someone needs to take out the garbage. Those are conflicts, and those aren't going to go away. So it's not, and those are things that are also, habitual and repetitive, and they happen over and over again. So you're going to have to learn how to actively work toward peace with your roommates, with your housemates, with your significant other, with your coworkers, right? It's something that's active, not passive. Now, there's also other forms of violence I should mention, by the way, that we'll get to, because there is a tri-level nature to violence: individual, violence, I harm you, you harm me; institutional violence; and then structural, cultural violence. And those are all very different. But first, I want to talk about what a fragile state is, what a resilient state is, and then I think actually we'll just end with violent extremism, and then one day I will come back to the tri-level nature of violence. So let's talk about what a fragile state is really quickly. You could argue that the United States right now is a fragile state. It's a very fragile state. So a fragile state can be characterized by 5 different key things. There are many more things than just 5, and every single state is in its own particular social, political, and historical circumstances. That said, there are 5 things that I think you'll find universally across fragile states, and you'll also hear this from the USIP. Number 1, a fragile state is ineffective at meeting people's needs. They are not able to articulate the needs of their people. Number 2, the government lacks legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Why does the government lack legitimacy in the eyes of the people? Because they're unable to understand, articulate, and meet the needs of the people. Number 3, the social contract, or state-society contract, has been broken or is perceived to have been broken. Number 4, fragile states are highly correlated with poverty and political instability. Instability should not be mistaken for a lack of change. It's just that you can have change, but in a stable setting, in a stable environment, in a resilient environment where you're able to withstand that change without collapsing. And then, of course, number 5, fragile states are those that are least capable of managing their own internal conflict, arguably the United States right now. Fragile states are also unable, again, the highlight is that fragile states are unable to absorb an external shock without completely collapsing politically, culturally, economically. On the other hand, a resilient state is able to absorb a shock and respond to it effectively. And hopefully not, again, not predictably necessarily, but with some sort of stability. So there is change, but it's stable. Now let's talk about resilience. Resilience really is the ability of any individual, a household, a community, a workplace, some sort of state or system, like the United Nations, for example. It's the ability of any system or individual to basically absorb an external shock. That's something I've been saying a lot, so I want to make that clear. So, what are some of the things you find in a resilient state as opposed to a fragile state? In a resilient state, you'll find a few things. Number one, you'll find systems that are accountable. So accountable to the people, which would restore that sense of legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And also, these systems are inclusive, so people feel like their government represents them. Again, giving a legitimate air to the government. Number two, resilient states, I should say, are always trying to reduce, because this is an active process. Resilient states are constantly trying to reduce or minimize the possibility of violent conflict. Sometimes that means, not supporting inflammatory extremist narratives or rhetoric that amplify tensions. Sometimes that's, setting a good example as the president. Sometimes that is saying appropriate things publicly to people. But it's always about, actively working toward peace, which means trying to do damage control and also reduce the possibility of damage happening at all. And of course, you want to try to reduce the risk of any disasters. So economic disasters, climate disasters, a drought, floods, right? Tornadoes, wars, right? Going into wartime stuff. So these are all things to try to avoid if you want a resilient state. That said, again, let's bring this back to elections. Bringing this back to elections, not necessarily in the United States today, but around the world, elections can be a very violent thing in countries that are maybe more fragile or more weak. Elections in a country like maybe Russia or Venezuela might be particularly more sensitive events than elections, say, in France or in Canada or the UK. And it's important to understand that elections are a very tender event by nature, because that is the time in which, number one, you have, some actual inherent political conflict for a vision of the future. But also, elections are when we choose those who are supposed to represent us, and you might come to know this resentment in the form of the #NotMyPresident campaign online, but sometimes elections are not viewed as legitimate by everybody, and it's not even about whether or not an election is objectively legitimate. If it's even perceived as illegitimate, or the president is perceived as someone that does not represent you, you have a conflict. So it's not even about whether or not the president is operating in your best interests. If you perceive that the president is not, or the president actually is not, you have a conflict. And so elections are a very, very particular, special, fragile event, especially for any representative country like the United States, where we depend on being able to see ourselves represented in the government. And especially in a country, I should say, when we have 330 million plus people and only 2 candidates every 4 years, a lot of things that are actually quite complicated get boiled down to simple talking points and sound clips for YouTube and for Instagram, and it's really difficult to have an election in that sort of an environment where you're making such a big, impactful, meaningful decision, but it could be possibly a quite costly decision, because it's so hard for regular, everyday people who are working and living their lives to follow this stuff. And so elections are a very, very tender event. I think they always have been, and they always will be. So we have to learn how to be able to handle that without collapsing. So, how do we prevent electoral violence? Well, again, elections are a vulnerable time for any nation. That's just the fact. And preventing electoral violence means that communities are able to withstand the political rhetoric that inevitably will amplify pre-existing tensions, political tensions. Maybe there were already tensions about a debate regarding public option versus Medicare for all, but then someone comes out with an ad, an attack ad, and it amplifies that sense of urgency and that political tension. Communities have to be able to withstand that and just breathe through it and talk out those conflicts without devolving into chaos and into violent conflict. And again, that's because, for me, the end goal at all times is to prevent violent acts and even the threat of violence. I don't want to live in a country where people are making death threats because they don't like who you voted for online. I mean, what kind of behavior is that? What kind of an example are we setting for the world and for ourselves and for our children? And also, shouldn't we have higher standards for ourselves? I mean, where's our integrity, right? So this is also about integrity and about being mature enough to actually handle a representative government and being mature enough to handle a democracy and understanding that a democracy means that we try to be inclusive and accountable, but that doesn't mean you're always going to win. That does include compromise. And that's something I think people forget a lot. Now, speaking of people who have forgotten this, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a huge increase in the number of acts that are, violent acts, that are sort of rooted in extremist causes, whether those are political, social, or cultural. Those are maybe religious based or based in some other social grievance. The point is, over the last 10 years for sure, and I could say maybe even over the last 20 years, the 21st century really has been a century full of, in some ways, different, evolutions in violent extremism that's based in various political grievances, many of which, are related to sort of global themes in this new, sort of globalist world that we're living in, where not only are goods and services crossing borders quickly, in unprecedented fashion, but so is information and data, and so is, conflict and ideas, and that includes good ideas, but also bad extremist ideas and extremist narratives. By the way, if you are more interested in extremist narratives, I literally just did an episode a few days ago on my audio-only podcast. You can find that on Apple, Google, Spotify. It's called Countering Extremist Narratives, I believe. That said, so let's talk about ways quickly as we wrap up to counter violent extremism. Actually, before that, first, let's just talk about the drivers of violent extremism, and then we'll end on a good note with how to counter violent extremism, and then we'll call it a day. So, the drivers of violent extremism: social marginalization. That is a huge one. The whole reason we say inclusivity is because it is one of those needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Humans need to feel like they belong. Humans need a group. We are social animals. Even those of us that just want to stay on our phone all day long are spending our time on Instagram because that's where people are. Or we're living in cities, or we're playing video games with other people. Human beings are social creatures. This is why things like solitary confinement are known to be one of the worst things you can do to a human being, because we are social creatures who also have an inherent desire and a need to express ourselves. So social marginalization is one of the largest drivers of radicalization, which leads to violent extremism. Number two, on the other side of that coin of social marginalization, political exclusion. If people feel like they can't access their government, well then frankly they're going to want, a revolution, or they're going to want to drain the swamp. People want to feel like they have some say in the place they live in their environment, and in their nation. People want to live here and love living here, and they want to be able to help determine the future of this place and determine their own fate. So people want to need to be politically included. Number three, lack of access to justice for resources. That's actually a legitimate one. Our government has become very big, but not with the growth, we have not also seen a growth in efficiency or sophistication. And there are many parts of the government that just seem so hard to access, so hard to get to. Sometimes it seems so hard to even just get to the truth about what's happening in Washington. And then number 4, repression or abuse by state and security actors. That one, you might actually find, for example, maybe in a military state or in a military junta where you actually have National Guard, or even here, maybe during, like, right now during some of the protests or during the Vietnam War protests, people actually, having violent conflict and violent engagements with law enforcement and state actors. And that is something that fuels anger and radicalization and therefore violent extremism and that sort of a mindset and the desire for violence overall. Now, again, some of the things I want to end on. While there has been a huge increase in violent extremism over the last 20 years, I think that we are very much aware of it, and I think we have a lot of tools that we really just need to employ. Now, again, countering violent extremism focuses also on countering the pull of terrorist recruitment and influence of terrorists by building resilience among those populations that are vulnerable to radicalization. And building resilience might be including people into the conversation who were once excluded from the conversation. And then, of course, violent extremism is a violence that is inspired and justified by and associated with an extreme political, religious, or social ideology. That definition is coming from the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you, everybody, for listening to The Riley Lewis Show. I greatly appreciate your time. If you'd like to support me, you can hit that subscribe button down below, or like this video, or leave me a comment in the comment section. You'll also find a link in the description to my Patreon account where you can donate. That would be greatly appreciated. You can also donate to my virtual wallet on anchor.fm. Thank you again for listening to The Riley Lewis Show, and I will see you here again tomorrow.